Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the session today. We'll go ahead and get started. It's 1 minute after, and I suspect we'll have people join as we go through. My name is Russ Albright, and I'm here with Larry Marson. And the focus of today's webinar is, once you've bought the company, what do you do now? And how do you drive value creation in the R&D space? So again, I'm Russ Albright. I'm the CEO and founder of Crosslake Technologies. I have about 25 years plus experience in software development. So I've been in consulting type companies, done a few startups, and then did my obligatory time with Microsoft. Every Seattleite has to join Microsoft at some point or another. So I spent about 13 years with Microsoft, primarily in the Windows division. So I'll turn it over to Larry for an introduction.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending the session. My name is Larry Marson. I'm a service leader here at Crosslake. I've been in the technology sector for over 30 years. And mostly in software development. I've done product management, customer support, and professional services. I've had the opportunity to work at both large companies like Hewlett-Packard. I was at Microsoft for a while, as well as small startups. And I've been at Crosslake for a couple of years. Before we go into the session, I wanted to hand it over to James Waletsky, who will be moderating for us, and he'll explain how we can ask questions along the way, and we'll save some time at the end for questions as well. James?
Thanks, Larry. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. My name is James Waletsky. I'll be your moderator behind the scenes. I'm a partner here at Crosslake. And first thing I wanted to point out is that you can get the slides from the handouts area of your GoToWebinar client. So if you want to download the PDF, feel free to do that at any point. Also, during the webinar, ask questions through the chat window. You should have a questions window or chat window through your GoToWebinar client as well. Ask there, and someone will be available to help you out. With that, I hope you enjoy the webinar. We'll save some time at the end for questions as well, additional questions as we go. And we can always unmute you in the end as well if you want to ask verbally instead of by text, but we're going to leave that until the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to the gurus, Russ and Larry, to take you the rest of the way.
Great, thank you, James. So first, what are we trying to accomplish in this next hour? And what we really want to share with you is the why, what, and how of driving value creation in the R&D space. And we have a ton of experience in that space, as well as we look at about 300 companies, or we looked at about 300 companies over the course of the past couple years, whether it's been doing technical due diligence or sell-side diligence or value creation type work. So through that process, we've identified what we see as a lot of the common challenges that impact value that's being generated by R&D, and some pretty typical and straightforward solutions that you can apply to those problems. Most of the things that we're going to talk about today are fairly high level, but what we've tried to do is provide detailed references on each slide that you can further dig into for specifics. So with that in mind, I'll jump to the next slide and start talking about why, at least we think it's important to think about value creation in the R&D space. And the number one item, at least that we see and our clients see, is that valuations are going up, up, up. There's a lot of competition for individual deals. And at the end of the day, with those prices going up, well, how do you get the right return from investment from those? And what we find also is, in a lot of instances, the various private or growth equity firms actually need to take into consideration the value impact into their bids to win the deal ultimately. So from an R&D standpoint, there seems to be a certain amount of myths or concerns or maybe afraid to get in and really drive value creation in R&D. It's a newer area for most people, so most folks focus first on getting cost out or maybe cross-sell opportunities and such. But at least in our experience, we find it's a really fruitful area with a lot of low-hanging opportunity to drive improvements. And typically when we're working with various R&D firms, we're able to see 25% productivity improvements, which, considering R&D is frequently a good hunk of the OpEx expense, sometimes up to 50% in companies, that's a big value driver, whether it's coming from cost reduction or whether it's coming from being able to get the right features out faster. So ultimately, that drives up profit, that drives up your return, and such. The other thing that we see is the reality is that in the technology space, things are happening so quickly, and you can get left behind in two fronts, really. One front is more about disruptive business models that are enabled by some of the new technology capabilities. The other side is really the productivity or development team in and of itself, even if those disruptive forces aren't in place. So some of these new technologies, some of the new development practices that are in place dramatically reduce the cost of development and delivering value to your customer. The other thing we commonly see is that when you focus on driving value in R&D and getting R&D cleaned up and really working well, is you're reducing your hold time. And we've seen instances where we've gone in, helped the company straighten a few things out, and they sell within a year. And they've got significant benefit out of the R&D side. So this is really why we're passionate about this particular area and why we wanted to do this webinar for your benefit. So moving on from there, so when we think about value creation levers in the R&D or in the software or technology space, we really think about how we drive up customer value and how we can get faster times to revenue. So basically that's getting to the right features faster and not spending resources on features that people don't spend money on. So those are two aspects that are critical from the growth standpoint. And then from the productivity or cost reduction standpoint, doing those while you're enhancing the productivity of the development group, as well as reducing the overall cost of delivery. When we think about increasing product quality, we think about this as a cost reduction also. So if you think about the cost of fixing defects in the product after it's been shipped, it's quite substantial, and it can even lead to customers not wanting to pay for their subscription or their license, or they want to delay payment. Then the surface area for R&D, we really think about product strategy in the middle. So if you have a good strategy going in an effective direction, that's a big driver of value or waste. And then the organizational components of R&D. So do you have a good lean, mean organization? Do you have the right architecture to basically drive your product strategy or enable your product strategy? Is your software development cycle transparent? Is it iterative? Can you see progress on a regular basis? And then the last big bucket of opportunity is in the infrastructure space. So do you have a cost-effective and reliable infrastructure? So with that in mind, I'll jump to the next slide where we start talking about product strategy, and I'll turn it over to Larry.
Thank you, Russ.
Larry, take it away.
Yep. So a lot of times when we come into companies, what we see is that they really don't have a product strategy, and so or it's not very well articulated or understood by the team. And so if you look at the graphic on the right, what you see a lot of times are groups sort of moving in opposite or different directions. And so it becomes counterproductive. So for example, a company could have a legacy product that they want to put into maintenance mode, but the group that's managing that product continues to evolve and add features to it and not really getting value from them. And in parallel, they're going after a new market, and they're trying to invest in that with a different set of products. And so what we end up with situations where you're overspending versus the opportunity, and you're not really well coordinated. And so it's really hard to get a good, clear return on revenue return when the group isn't aligned on one mission. They all know their role within that mission, and they're all moving forward towards that. Next slide, please.
Sorry, just a couple extra points to add in on that. One of the things we see when this product strategy is not aligned and everybody pushing in the right direction, you see a lot of projects that end up getting started and they stop and maybe get killed. So we've seen instances where projects may go for 6 months to a year, 2 or 3 teams working on it get killed. So there's hundreds of thousands of dollars of wasted R&D effort. Or as Larry mentioned, working on features that really have no clear revenue commitment, or the sales team is not even committed to selling those or ready to sell. So either you don't get that revenue impact, significant delay. And then the other thing we commonly see is resources shifting around. And we bring these type of problems up because, and we're trying to put them in a vein where people from outside the company, or CEO and other executives in the company, can see these challenges and identify them as problems.
So what are some of the solutions to address this? The biggest thing to focus on is product management. Getting product management right really has a magnifying effect on how the company operates, how well they deliver, how well they're meeting their revenue targets. And so the first thing that we would suggest is that you really need to invest in product management. It's important to hire somebody with professional product management experience that understands the domain, understands how to do business analysis, knows how to prioritize decisions. A lot of times we see there is no real formal product management in place. Sometimes it's the CEO acting as it, the CTO, or they've moved someone from a different role into product management, but they don't have that background and experience. And what we find is that if you bring in the right resources with those skills, they can take the various groups, align them against the strategy and a plan, and execution just naturally improves. An example of where a strong product manager and with a product strategy can help is around portfolio rationalization. A lot of times you see companies that have legacy products that are being put in maintenance mode, and they have new investments that are driving new revenue. And if you take a look at the amount of investment they're putting into those, sometimes they match, which is kind of strange. And so we see companies that invest up to 10% of their annual revenue on a legacy product, which really isn't driving, it's really not driving a lot of value there. And so a product manager can come in and sort of bucketize each of their products, and legacy products are put into one side, and you try to drive down investment in there and to a minimal, around 3 to 4%. And then the areas that you've targeted for growth that have solid business cases, and and you have a good view of what return you're going to get, you can start targeting higher investment in there, pushing it to 10 to 12%. And so you get the team sort of focused on driving the value and investing in where the value is going to be driven, and not investing in areas that just are not going to grow for the company. A key thing that has to happen as part of that is, you need to have an annual product strategy plan and a roadmap developed against that. Really important for that. Really important that sets a direction. The roadmap should be updated, should be part of that annual planning exercise, but then have quarterly refreshes, because things do change in the market. And so you don't want to be so dogmatic against your roadmap that you're not willing to change, but you do want to have it as a guiding light for the team to rally around and do their development against those priorities in the roadmap.
This is Russ, just to jump in a second also on the road of the product strategy. The product strategy, we really encourage people, if they don't have one really today and written down, start with something simple, right? So it doesn't have to be necessarily a strategy that the team spends months and months and months putting together. It can start with something fairly straightforward. Could be as simple as, team, we're going to focus on this vertical or this particular market, and these are the kind of features we're going to add. Or it could be as simple as this product's in maintenance mode, and because of that, we're really going to focus on how do we maximize the profitability of this product. So you're changing the dynamic from generating a lot of features to basically saying, how do we maintain this product at a lower cost end to end? So those are two really critical points when you're thinking of product strategy. Okay, jumping forward to organization.
Yeah, so the next area to look at for where we see problems and opportunities are in organization. And so over time, as the business grows and the group evolves, what we often see is that the management team tends to become top heavy and siloed. And so you have these groups, you have these layers of management, and you're a fair distance away from at the executive level down to where the developers that are actually doing the work. And so it's kind of hard to really get a good pulse and pulse on what on the work that people are doing, what is the status against it, and that kind of stuff. The other thing that we see is that many times, we have long tenured employees and they kind of become stagnant, and so they're in a particular role and they feel comfortable in that role, but they're probably not contributing at their peak. And so looking at, you want to address that through job rotation and other things, but if you don't address that, it tends to become stagnant and not as creative as it could be. Oftentimes companies have done acquisitions along the way, and without proactively thinking about it, they end up with multiple locations. And so it's very hard to manage a distributed team, especially if it's not a large team. And so, organizations in the 30 to 35 range that are working across 3 or 4 different sites, it's very hard to coordinate. It's very hard to get alignment, and it's just inefficient. Another area that we often see is ineffective offshoring. Offshoring is actually a very good way to grow your team, to grow the team quickly when you need to. It's a good way to have your local team focused on what their real core competencies are, and then outsource things that you don't feel are core to your business. However, people start off with the view that outsourcing is going to be cheap, and they often move far too quickly, and in the end, it's not you run into lots of quality problems, you run into communication problems, you run into problems where mandates are not very clear, and so you end up with an offshoring strategy that in the end doesn't really save you as much money as you would have thought, and isn't really contributing to the product the way you'd expect it to when you set it up.
And I'll chime in here just for a second. Just to whet everybody's appetite, we're going to have an upcoming webinar on how to do offshoring in the most effective way possible with great tips and tricks, so stay tuned for that.
So some of the recommendations we have on how to address this, the first thing we suggest looking at is flattening the organization. So you want to reduce the number of management layers, so that at the executive level, you can get quick visibility into what the teams are doing, what their project statuses are, things like that. The other thing that we recommend as part of flattening this organization is in trying to remove the silos. Look at putting together multifunction teams. And so instead of having a separate quality assurance team led by a quality assurance leader and a separate development team led by development leaders, take the teams and have them combined development and QA. What that does is just it increases exponentially the level of collaboration between dev and QA. Russ talked earlier about the cost of finding defects late in the cycle versus early on. Having those teams sitting together, working together on a day-to-day basis, allows them to identify quality issues early and upfront, and not have to address them at the end of the cycle where costs are significantly higher. We're not suggesting you don't need a quality leader, because it's important to make sure that the quality practices across the organization are consistent and effective, but they don't necessarily have to report to that quality leader, and the quality leader can manage the QA in a matrix fashion, but make sure that you have these multifunctional teams. Another thing that companies don't do a lot of it, because the larger companies are very good at this. Some of the smaller ones just haven't put it in place, and that's focusing on annual performance evaluations. There's no better tool than focusing on those things where you identify who your strong performers are and who your not so strong performers are, and allowing it gives you an opportunity to take actions against some of the lower performers, either by job rotation or actually exiting the company. But going hand in hand with that would be putting together a new hire recruiting program. It's a very good suggestion to try to get close with some of the local universities and build an intern program where you can have a funnel of new grad students coming in. The value in that is sort of twofold. One, the new grads come in with modern technology skills. Like if you take a look at a typical software developer, their skills are aged they're aged after 4 to 6 years, and so so unless they have deep domain expertise or they're continually upgrading their skills, the technology changes so quickly that they're left behind. And so you can bring in an influx of new hires that actually bring in those technology skills and actually bring them in at a much lower cost. And so that's something that we encourage companies to take a look at. As James mentioned on outsourcing, outsourcing is a topic all unto itself. And so we do have an upcoming webinar planned on that. But in the meantime, we've put some references in the document there on simple outsourcing checklists and for do's and don'ts. We find that very valuable, and it's something that's worth taking a look at as you go and take a look at your portfolio companies.
Thanks, Larry. Just to add my 2 cents on this slide too, on these different ideas. On the performance evaluations, I mean, there's such a thing called healthy attrition, and when we're looking at various companies and we see that they don't have any attrition, that's typically unhealthy. And what it generally means is, well, you've done a great job of retaining your workforce, so that part's healthy. But on the other side, you're really trying to take out the people that are your lower performers and free up room to bring in new talent. So you should have healthy attrition someplace in that 5% or maybe even higher range. And again, that opens up opportunities to bring in new people, new blood, new thinking, and at a lower cost. And arguably, these new hires, when you're getting top-notch people from local universities and such, you start getting a reputation. It makes it easier to hire people because you're getting a reputation as a great place to come in right out of university and start your career. And within typically a year or two, they're surpassing the people that you cleaned out from the organization. The other thing I think that's really worth pointing out, if you look over to the right on these 2 organization charts, is when you go to more of this flatter team-based model that you'll see on the right, you're taking out at least one layer of people managers, right? People telling other people what to do. And on top of that, what you're doing is the managers that do exist, you're changing their mental model. They're going from people managers to delivery managers and delivery drivers, right? So they're really focused on how do we get good software out the door? And really the responsibility to a great extent is within the teams to self-manage. And as you see these great teams working together really well, you keep them together and they drive each other to perform at a higher level. And if the team isn't working effectively and not driving itself to a higher level, you just blow the team up and form a new team and get the right mix of people together. And then the other interesting part to bring this out, back to Larry's point on quality, is now the dev and test combined team is owning the quality, as opposed to a dev team developing code, sending it over to testers to test and ensure the quality's there, or try and ensure the quality. Now they're working together, they co-own that quality. And you'll actually even see in a lot of organizations where they're basically shrinking their test head count, and they're able to do this effectively without impacting quality. by continuing to add more and more automation and more development type resources. So basically the development team is owning testing instead of a separate test role even. So Larry, I'll jump to the next slide.
So another area for improvement or as a problem area is around the software development life cycle. A lot of companies believe that they're agile, but in effect, what they've really done is they've adopted some agile tooling, which is a good thing. They've developed some agile processes, but over time, they're not executing in an agile way. And so while they're leveraging these tools and processes, they're not getting the results that agile would give you. And so what you end up seeing are long release cycles. So you've got releases that span multiple months. They miss their commitment dates, things like that. And the difficulty with long releases is that a lot of times, by the time if you draw out your requirements at the start, and then 6 months later, some of those requirements are not as meaningful or not as valid as they used to be when they were first created. And so you end up delivering things that aren't really meeting the customer needs. You're delivering them late, and a lot of times you're delivering them with poor quality. So that's an issue. That's an issue to take a look at. Russ talked in the previous slide also about excuse me, automation resources. We see a lot of companies that rely very heavily on manual testing. I remember we looked at one company a while ago, and before they want to release their software to market, they do a regression test run, and to execute all of their test cases, their regression test cases, would take them 2 months. And so every release they have to make a decision on, do I run all my regression test cases and take 2 months before I can push this release out to market, or do I shorten my test cycle and carry the risk of having quality issues out in the field because I don't want to take this long. And so that's another one that sort of leads to those long meandering release cycles that really creates problems for companies. And so I'm sorry. So that's one key area that we do want to focus on as a potential solution going forward. So some areas for improvement. What we see with Agile, if you implement Agile correctly, you can actually see 25% improvement in efficiency. And so we encourage people to look at how to effectively implement Agile, and using through training and bringing in resources that are experienced in Agile. Important as part of this is really important to have metrics that you measure the development quality against. So and important at the executive level that you get visibility into those. And so while you have the development teams executing their sprints and making their deliverables, what's really important, those delivery managers that we referred to previously, is that they're able to tie what's happening in those sprints back into what's happening in the features in the roadmap that you want to track at the executive level. And so making sure that linkage is created, that you understand what those metrics are. So at a regular interval, either monthly or quarterly, at the executive level or at your board meetings, you can clearly see here's the release I'm planning and we're working on. These are the features we're trying to deliver to. This is the status against this, and this is how it maps to the individual work that people are doing. Without that, it's very difficult for you as a leader in the company to really understand how well the development team is doing, what sort of course correction you need to do, what changes you might need to make. Also, as the team grows, you may also need to take a look at how do you scale agile. With a small number of teams, just standard agile is fine. Once you start to get beyond 5 teams, you really need to look at how you want to scale that. The next one, and we talked about that, going back to the example in the previous one. If that company that we were working with could automate their testing, automate their regression testing, you get 2 benefits, right? Instead of taking months to run your regression test, you can do it in days or even hours, right? That just saves a ton of time and money. And the good part is, when you automate these tests, you can run them continually throughout the cycle, and so you don't have to do this big bang test at the end. You could actually run test cases on every load build, identify any defects, and fix those defects as you go, as opposed to building a whole backlog of defects and trying to fix those at the end. And what that gets you to is the ability to make sure that you're testing quality in right from the beginning and test it end to end throughout the cycle. That'll help improve your quality, help improve your release velocity, so you can deliver more quickly, and help you improve the predictability of those releases as well.
So just to jump on and add a couple points here, or clarify a couple points. When we think about development, really, speed kills, and the faster that you can iterate on things and get them complete, the better you are, the more productive you are. And if you look back to some of the historical ways of doing development, or teams that profess to be agile, but they're really doing some kind of a mini waterfall, there's long cycles between when I started something and when I complete something. And agile development, and some of the solutions that are outlined here, are really about having shorter cycles, getting something done, right, so you can show it to people. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the company has to release every day or even every quarter. They may have a annual release cycle that more lines up with what their customers want, but they're able to still release on a very timely basis. So if I use an example of Windows, for Windows 7, which is the last project that I was involved in, we released that after about 2 years of development, but we were able to do internal releases every day. So we were able to release it out to key partners, to external testers, and get feedback on a very regular basis. So we always knew how we were progressing through that development cycle. And it was also always highly transparent to our leadership team and our investors how we were progressing, because they could actually see what had been completed and ready to ship, but not commercially shipped until after a couple years.
The next lever to look at is architecture. A lot of times what we see in companies is they have legacy software that's out of date and difficult to maintain. I've seen examples where people are, an integral part of their product is on software that is no longer supported, potentially has several security flaws, and there's nothing they can do about it because it's such a big part of their product, and so that creates lots and lots of risk. You also see situations where the software is not that well understood, and so designers, if there's a problem or a problem they need to fix, or an enhancement that they need to build, they're afraid to go and touch the software, because if they touch it, then it'll break, or it'll break something else. And so what they end up doing is coding around it, and what that creates is an even bigger mess, and an even bigger mess that's hard to maintain and evolve, and you just naturally slow down. A lot of that, the big reason why that happens is that there's really no technical direction being set on where do we see the end state of this of the software being? What are the steps that we need to take to evolve it? And what are the plans? And that comes from twofold. Sometimes there's a lack of architectural skill sets within the company, and that causes a problem, or there's a lack of investment in that area because you're so used to driving off a customer request. And so if a customer needs this, that takes precedent. And then over time, what happens is your software becomes very brittle, fraught with errors, difficult to maintain and evolve, and you end up moving very, very slowly at that point. So I won't go into a lot of detail on this. We do have, much like outsourcing, modernizing legacy architectures is a webinar unto itself, and we do have that planned. But just a couple of things that I'd like to point out on this one. It's important to have, in addition to the feature roadmap where you want to deliver customer features, it's important to have an architectural roadmap, and so that you know where you want to take the software over time. And to do that, it's helpful to have like a chief architect role whose responsibility is to maintain that roadmap. Now, everybody has a business to run, and so it's important that you manage the level of investment in architecture and balance that against new feature development. And so it's important that when that chief architect is making those recommendations on areas of the architecture to invest, that they really that they understand the ROI on that investment, and making sure that what it's the right level of investment for payback for the work that they're doing.
Yeah, just to add some points to this, because I think this is a super important area where you can get a great amount of value, and likewise you can waste a lot of time improving technology that doesn't really need to be improved. And so to call out this point on making sure there's ROI. So just like any time your teams are investing in feature development, when you think of architecture, we should think of the ROI there also. So by making these changes to the technology, what are we getting out of it? What's the improved development productivity that comes out of it? What is the improved ability to release features and value, etc.? And certain of the things that I would really encourage folks to think about is, if you're looking at you've got a monolithic application, it's getting older. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to rewrite the whole application. It could be as simple as you're figuring out ways to create integration and API type layers where you can get the older monolithic product to effectively talk to new technologies. And so you're avoiding rewriting significant parts of that older technology, and the solutions still work great. And frequently those more monolithic technologies, they're tried and true, they work, they scale, customers like them, you've got a great footprint. So the last thing you want to do is disrupt that. So you can kind of get the best of both worlds by maintaining that and really thinking about how you build API layers to talk to your newer services that you're developing. And these newer services, microservices or open source based technologies, etc., I mean, they're very efficient for your development team to operate and add and replace and change out. So if you think about changing out a fairly small service is a lot easier than rewriting a big part of the monolith. So that's key things that we would really encourage folks to think about whenever they're making big technology investments is, what is that ROI? Are there ways to basically get the value of modern technologies without doing a lot of rewriting? And are you really thinking, when you're writing newer code, are you really thinking about some of these newer techniques like using microservices, containers, etc. in your development? We have an upcoming webinar on this also, and then there's also a lot of great reference content here that you can access and find helpful. Okay, so jumping forward.
I'm going to jump in here with a question. We've got a question from David who says, you know, we've covered some things so far. There's a lot of ideas here. What do you typically recommend or see the best results as a first course of action post-acquisition? A, align processes and architectural goals followed by org changes, or B, make org changes followed by process and architecture alignment?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would say it really depends. So there's a lot of instances where the organization is pretty well sorted, and so it's really a matter of getting a good strategy both on the product side and on the technical side and driving that forward. And so that's the way I would start if that's the situation. If the situation is more that the organization, that you need to shuffle the organization up, or you need to clean house, basically, for no better term, then usually what I highly encourage is let's get the organization fixed up. And the rationale for that is kind of twofold. One, you want to make sure you have the right people in that can help drive some of these value creation initiatives. And then the other thing that we think about is you don't want to spend a lot of precious time and resources trying to train up and change people that aren't going to be here for the long haul. Larry, anything you would want to add to that?
No, I think you said you got it bang on. Like, it really depends on the situation, but I think your last point is really smart, though, that you don't want to spend a lot of energy on getting people trained up into when they're not going to be there to actually execute against it.
The other point I would add on here too is that, at least from my perspective, the first thing I try and do, even if you've got some architectural challenges, the first thing I think about is making sure that we've got the right organizational capability and productivity to effectively execute on those feature and architectural challenges. So if you focus on that first, and making sure that's in place, so hopefully it is in place, but if not, if you clean that part up, get that working really well, then when you shift gears and you start working on improving architecture, you're able to do it faster, right? Because you've built that capability in the development team. And frequently what you can do is, while you're building up that capability, you're spending time working through your architectural vision and roadmap, working through your product strategy, getting those where you really want them to be and providing the right direction simultaneously. And again, then your team is ready to execute on those once the capability is built up. Great question. Okay, so I'll jump to the next slide on infrastructure.
Yeah. So the next lever to take a look at it is on infrastructure. So a lot of times when these companies were first formed and they were building out cloud either didn't exist or still wasn't mature enough, and so there was reticence to move to it, and so they built out their own hardware and infrastructure, either on premise or in a hosted data center. And then over time, that made sense. That made perfect sense at the time. But then, as what we tend to see is people start to feel comfortable with it because it's something that they know, and they continue to grow. They continue to grow out their hardware, their own hardware infrastructure. That becomes very expensive over time. You have to buy enough capacity to meet your needs. You have to maintain the hardware, things like that. Like an example of one of the company that we were working with, they have their own data center. In the normal course of action, the amount of compute power that they take is about 10 to 20% of their capacity, but they have to engineer it for 100% capacity. to make sure that they hit, they manage their peak traffic. That's a pretty expensive proposition to have to maintain all the time. That's an issue. The other things that happen a lot of times is to reduce costs, because it is expensive. They don't deploy in a fault tolerant manner. They deploy like single instances, and so if you do have a failure, your system goes down, as opposed to being able to fail over either to another redundant site in case of disaster recovery, or even to a redundant machine in the same data center. And so while it might not happen often, but when it does, you run the risk of your business being down for multiple hours to days with those kind of things. And so looking at more modern technologies and ways to do this by leveraging public cloud would help alleviate a lot of those problems.
Hey guys, we have another question. Just want to chime in from Bradley, and he says, just a clarifying question for scope. Is there a rough assumption for the company size that we're talking about here, like revenue or R&D expense or something else? Because, for example, if we're talking about a $1 billion revenue company, there's a different level of internal capability than, let's say, a $20 million company. So can you clarify that?
Sure. You're absolutely right. There's different levels for depending on the size of the company. But these problems that we see both with small companies, small companies all the way up to billion-dollar companies. It's a lot of it depends on the legacy of the company, where they've come from, where they've started, and whether they follow the kind of practices that we've been talking about in terms of bringing in new grads, looking at modernizing technologies and that kind of stuff. These problems and solutions apply to both.
Yeah, I would agree with that in my experience too. That size doesn't matter, and you've got different challenges as you grow, and sometimes the size actually works against you, even though you may have resources that can help drive a lot of these initiatives. It's like moving a big tanker, basically, whereas a small company can be more nimble, can catch on quicker. But I don't think of it from a size perspective. I almost view it as there's three types of scenarios that you're looking at. One is the company is growing quite fast, and it really needs to think about how to scale up and grow the organization, grow the people, grow the processes. So scaling up people, being able to add people faster, etc. And another very typical scenario is kind of at the other end of the spectrum, where a company's been around for a while, it's had a great growth spurt at some point, and it's got a great footprint in its industry or customer base, and what they're trying to do is reinvigorate where they are and continue to grow, right? So get back into that growth mode. And that's a classic example where you have some nice, well-established legacy products, and you're trying to think through, well, how do I cost effectively modernize these so I can start going after new adjacent markets or more effectively add features. And probably the third scenario we see a lot of is a company that's migrated from more of a non-technology company to a tech company, whether it's service enabled or it may have started as something totally different and then turned into a product company. Like we had one company, it was a book publisher, and used a lot of software to help distribute its content, and ultimately said, geez, the software model is a lot better, let's start doing that, and drop the publishing aspects. But in the back of its mind, it still operates like a publishing company. They don't think of themselves as the software is really their primary and core competency. So those are the three situations that we typically see, and so the approach usually ends up being a little bit different for those. So we're kind of running short of time, and we want to get to the last couple slides before we open it up for questions. So I'm going to cut infrastructure off and jump forward here really quickly. And Larry, if you don't mind, I'll grab this really quick. So we've given you some ideas on the typical problems that you can go attack, and some things that you can encourage as solutions that teams do. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to putting those into action and getting the results. And something we frequently see when companies are going through more of a transformation phase is it's really not clear if they're making progress, right? So they might be doing a lot of things, could be a lot of activities, and you know, life happens. You know, customers have issues, you got to respond to them, and so you get conflicting priorities. So at the end of the day, you start these transformation initiatives, and for whatever reason, they don't make the progress that you're really expecting them to make, and it's hard to tell if you're making progress. So some potential solutions to that is, one is we really encourage post-acquisition is you get together as soon as possible, you know, with the company, the leadership of the company, the R&D leadership, the CEO, the board, et cetera. And you get some agreement on what are the things you would love to see the R&D group tackle to improve their capabilities, whether it's the org, process, people, architecture, whatever it may be, and get them on a transformation roadmap. And keep in mind, this is more than a 60, 90, 100-day plan. This is really something that may need to take place over a multi-year period of time to be effective. And so the beauty about these roadmaps is they get a clear Gantt view of what is your timeline you expect it to take to put something into place, this improvement, who's going to own it, and you know, it's typically stacked ranked, so everybody's aligned on, you know, where we're going to focus our energy and why we're going to focus our energy there. So you get organized, kind of like your product strategy, right? You've got everybody aligned here, and you've got a clear set of performance metrics. So as you're moving forward, you know you're getting the result you want. And if you're not, you're continuing to iterate on that until you really see the value. And so back to continuous improvement, you're really seeing the value that you need to get from that transformation. One other super important point to make is these roadmaps, and the reason we call it a roadmap is it really needs to be integrated in with the product roadmap and become part of what the development team and product team are working on a regular basis. So if it's a separate initiative, we usually find they stall out, they don't make progress. But if you build it into your roadmap and make it one of the priorities, whether it's changing the architecture or adopting a new tool that's more productive, if it's in the roadmap, it gets worked on. If it's not in the roadmap, it doesn't get worked on. And then the last part is having great governance and transparency. What we see a lot of our clients do is they'll take this roadmap and they'll go through it at a high level in, you know, every other board meeting or so, and go through the metrics and see how it's performing. And it just provides an extra set of accountability and eyeballs to keep the progress on and to make sure resources keep working on this and drive that improvement. All right, and then really quickly, here's just a simple sample of what a roadmap looks like, laying out the various initiatives, the timeline, who owns it, and target metrics for accomplishment. So James, I think we're into our QA time here, so I'll stop there and open it up to you to see if we have other questions.
All right, I think we've been through our queue of questions, but we're happy to unmute somebody if you have a question, you want to verbally ask it at this point, or continue, you know, with the typing in the chat window, and I'll pick those up and reiterate those. Right now, no questions. Here's actually, coincidentally, here's another one from Bradley. Can you give some examples of how to measure productivity improvements in R&D in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question, and in all honesty, it's hard. What we typically encourage people to do is really focus on delivery. What are you delivering, and what's the value of what you're delivering? And you know, typically what we find is if you can come up with a list of 10 things as an example that you need the R&D team to deliver on, and the organization says, those are important things. They're going to add a lot of value. You've got revenue commitments on those, and the team is delivering on those. That's a good sign of productivity. If you see, you know, low bug counts, good sign of productivity. If you see fast iterations, good signs of productivity. So it's almost like you're looking for signs of productivity as opposed to that magical number, which makes it a bit of a challenge. But you can start adding these things up, and you can add up things like, you know, how if you had a problem example with projects starting and then being killed, historically, how much effort went into that, and how much have you been able to reduce that? That's been a way that we've been able to measure productivity. Or if you're able to eliminate a lot of manual work, that's a good sign of productivity.
Great. We've got another one that's come in from Jim. How are you seeing the current talent environment, which has historically had low unemployment, impact these types of transformational efforts?
Yeah, another good question. So, I mean, we all know it's tight right now, worldwide. It's tight in finding resources, and we have our own development center in Estonia, and you know, unemployment levels are incredibly low. So the reality is, when we're working on these kind of initiatives, what we try and do is we're an augmenting resource to help drive these, because usually there's not people internally that can make them happen. Either they don't have the skill set or they don't have the capacity. And what we try and do whenever we're doing these transformation initiatives is work on initiatives first that free up people, right? That free up dead time, whether it's, back to Larry's earlier point, you've got a product, you're investing 10% of resources, you should invest 5. Okay, let's cut back that 5. We just freed up a lot of people to go work on other things. So we try and use that aspect to free up resources to reinvest in other improvements or more feature development as we attack that, because the reality in most instances, there's not a great body of people that you can just hire in. The other thing we encourage on these is, when you're doing an initiative, if it's not in your core competency and you need to get it done, that's a great time to find an outsourced entity that specializes in that and can just make it happen for you, as opposed to trying to train up your own people. And, you know, I'm sure your people are smart, they'll eventually get there, but people that do it every day are going to get it done in days or weeks or a few months. And it might take you a year to make that same improvement or rewrite that same application and get it in place. So those are a couple strategies that we encourage and use.
The other, if I could add to that, the other thing is really trying to leverage intern programs with universities, because then you can develop a relationship there, and that gives you a bit of a pipeline. And then more longer term, something to consider. You know, the typical centers like the Valley, or even in Seattle, where it's really hard. There are other places where you can look at different development, like as an additional development site, but that's lower cost and has better access to resources. So that's something else to consider. You don't necessarily want to keep your development, you know, in the Valley all the time. So there's other areas where you can move it to.
Great. Another question. Any advice for ways to attract talent to come to work on businesses with large legacy, like cash cow type businesses with old stodgy software?
Free food. That's a good start. Yeah. You know, so the thing that's really interesting about that is that we see that all the time, and the reality is these companies frequently, they're very cool products, and so you focus on the product, you focus on the values, you focus on how they can grow. And you know, the other thing that's really critical is, even if they're legacy products, you're doing new things. You're doing new things to improve that product, and you're starting to leverage modern technology. That becomes a very marketable skill set rather than just working on the whiz bang. The other thing is just locating your development folks in the right place. So if you're trying to be close to Seattle or Silicon Valley or some of the technical hotspots, it's going to be very difficult to attract talent and pull them away from a Microsoft or Google or, you know, whoever the hot company is at the moment. And so even if you're able to hire, you're going to pay way more and you're not going to get great talent. So we've seen that. And so we almost always just say, hey, if you're in those locations, think about moving to someplace where you're not competing. And then I think the reality is there's a lot of great locations for development around the US that are tier 2 cities where they will think it's cool to work on something that is a little bit older, right? So they don't have to be on the latest and greatest. Okay, so I'll pause there. James, any other questions we can answer?
I've answered a couple on the background, but I think we are good for now. We are 1 minute over. We want to be respectful of your time, so I think we'll wrap this one up. But if you'd like to get in touch with us, there are various ways to do that. There's an email at the bottom of the screen. If you've downloaded the slides, which you can still grab from the handouts, you can get our contact information out of that as well. Our website is www.crosslaketech.com. On the question on productivity, I have a blog that's already kind of in draft format that I want to publish around metrics aimed at the leadership of the company. So stay tuned for that on our website. We've got a series of blogs there that are available. Other than that, if you have additional questions, again, feel free to email us and we're happy to help. Stay tuned for some of our upcoming webinars. As we mentioned, modernizing legacy applications. It's going to focus a lot on the microservices architecture type style and how you get some of that, as we talked about earlier, old stodgy software into the new world. We're also going to have some topics on implementing DevOps and automation, as well as we mentioned as well, the outsourcing, the best practices and the tips and tricks. So with that, I'd like to thank Russ and Larry for a great presentation. And again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with us and stay tuned for future webinars. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.